also want to be known to every American as the group that's out there fighting about those textbooks in Texas that are controlling a national policy and saying we're going to speak up and say if they're going to have, as Obama said we're going to have, math and English standards, that science and history is not too controversial to have standards for as well. You know, when Eisenhower was president, he was for national science standards as a Republican. Jack Kennedy was for national science education standards as a Democrat. But now we hear that science and history are too controversial. What do they mean? They mean that evolution is now too controversial and that Thomas Jefferson is now too controversial. Well, we're going to stand up on behalf of those issues, and we have an obligation to do so. I call it a sacred obligation. I don't mean necessarily one God-related, but I mean an exalted obligation. You know, in my parents' time, there were giants that walked on the earth. One giant was 5'6", and his name was Martin Luther King. And another giant was 5'9", and his name was Robert Kennedy. And they were both religious people. And they used the word morality all the time. They used the word morality all the time. But what they meant by morality was not going around lecturing people about what you do with your private parts. The word morality has been stolen, and it's up to us. It's up to us in this room to take that word morality back for its true meaning, to help the underprivileged, to help the dispossessed, to help bring America back to its true heritage. And our true heritage is a heritage of separation of church and state. I thank you for hearing me out, and I'm eager to answer any questions that you have. And shoot away if people want to ask questions. Maybe what I'll do, because I'm terrible at remembering, raise your hands if you got questions. Let's do that. You guys keep them up. So let's see here. We'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm expecting you to remember your numbers, not me. So 1.
I don't know if it's a question so much as a statement, but I am just so energized by what you presented tonight. And I think you're so right on. I got involved in this movement after the November 08 election, and I stood on the street corners with my Don't Want Hate sign next to busloads of Mormons that were bussed in from other states.
Right.
And I got so angry at the amount of money that was pumped into the political process, tax exempt, and that just, so I'd be interested in hearing your comment about if that's sort of on the horizon with your tactics. But I live sort of in the closet in South Orange County, and I don't let my neighbors know I go to these meetings because it's just, it's really hard to articulate in a way that means anything to people what these organizations stand for. You talk about a cross in the Mojave Desert, and people are like, why are you so worked up about that? You know, what's wrong with having a cross that honors our veterans? And it's very intangible, and it's very cerebral, and unless you're really passionate about these kinds of issues, which there's a lot more religious people who are passionate about it than the average Joe Sixpack. But what you articulated, I think, hits people more where they live. And I think to, like you said, reframe kind of the discussion, the conversation, in a way that matters to the I'm a soccer mom, you know, what you talked about resonates with me. I think that's very powerful. And so I'm anxious to...
Well, thank you. And one thing I would ask everyone, because I will be spanked back in Washington, D.C., because I didn't do this, is pretty please go to www.secular.org and sign up for our action alerts. In fact, let me ask you, how many people in this room are already signed up for Secular Action Alerts from our website? So maybe 1/4 if I'm lucky. So I'm asking everybody else in the room, please, to sign up for our action alerts. It is our #1 mechanism for communicating to thousands of people at one time. And it's how you find out about some of these issues I've been talking about tonight. So when you know there's a vote pending in Congress, you'll have notice from us about that. And I'd ask those of you who already are signed up for our action alerts to please forward it to 5 friends. If you agree with what I was talking about tonight, forward our action alert sign up to 5 friends and say, hey, please sign up for this organization so you can get involved. To address one of your points, you were talking about the issue of the taxation in churches. And the common counter-argument that you will get, and there's some validity to it, is people will say, well, listen, if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, then you're also tax exempt. But there are a couple things that are left out of that. One I mentioned, and that has to do with the parsonage issue. Trust me, as executive director of this nonprofit, I don't get any tax exempt status for my residents. But you do if you're a minister, no matter how big and how fancy that home is. and it's really an outrage. And we are going to start speaking out about that issue and illustrating that issue. And again, I think that's something that resonates in a way with the average citizen. People care about, that wallet. And when they find out that somebody's living a life of jet-set luxury, and I'm not saying all men, there are many very humbly, living ministers and rabbis and so forth. But among some of the mega churches, these people live jet-set lifestyles, and they have this exemption for their residents that's truly an outrage, a completely unethical provision in law, and we're going to start targeting that. Here's another one that's really, I think, an outrage to citizens. This has to do with, if you're familiar, with nonprofit organizations, you've got to file your 990, right? You've got to file that with the IRS. That's what we have to do. That's what all the organizations have to do. But if you are totally focused on helping poor children because you're a secular nonprofit, then you've got to file all this paperwork and have sunshine. And I don't object to it. I mean, that's fine. That's what we have to do. But if you're a religious organization and you don't devote all your money to helping poor children, but maybe have it to help the minister have a really big house, then you don't have to file a 990. Then it's much harder to find out what are the internal financial workings of these religious businesses or organizations, whatever you want to call them. We say, let the sun shine. Unless you've got something you're afraid of, let's look and see what your internal financial workings are in these religions. Let's know what's going on. So that's another issue we're going to raise. Here's a third one with regard to tax issues that's really just infuriating and dramatic to me, is that I don't know how many people in this room have ever been audited or maybe been with a nonprofit where you're audited. For religious organizations, there's a special provision that they cannot be audited unless there's clearance from a high IRS official. As a practical matter, that means not too often. That it's not often that an IRS official, and when you think about the logic of the situation, one, there's not much sunshine on their internal finances, so it's difficult to know whether or not, other than just randomly doing so, whether or not an audit is appropriate. So it really creates what I call a black box for the internal finances of churches, and ones that oftentimes engage in activities that are either border on the inappropriate or are inappropriate. Last thing I want to say in response to you is, I mean, I understand, and I get it, this is Orange County, and I grew up in Orange County, I know it's, certainly not San Francisco. I mean, that's not what we're talking about here. But I really believe this. I served 10 years in politics, and I represent a pretty small town. And in politics in Maine is different than California. I mean, California is like a country. But in Maine, we run for office the old-fashioned way. I knocked on every single person's door in my district. And I knocked on Stephen King's door and talked to him. And I would go to the poorest person's home and talk to them face to face. And one thing I saw, and I think it's true here as well, is that I saw people who cared about their kids and went to help them at soccer and participated in their community. But what I saw in our community had a lot of Catholicism and a lot of Jewish community. But I saw the numbers. I just observed that the attendance was heading down for those types of organizations, while people were just as civically minded. And so all I'm saying to you that a lot of times, especially if you articulate some of the issues I'm talking about here, that we can find that people say, thanks for mentioning that, because that's what I think too. I think we sometimes perceive ourselves as being more of a minority than we are. I mean, if you look at the current occupant of the house that's 3 blocks from my office, President Obama is an African American. That's 13% of the population. By pretty much any measure, there's at least that percentage that are non-theistic in the United States of America today, and more, depending on how you measure it. And yet, we feel like we're this minority that can't have an influence. I think we can have an influence. I think we can speak out. And I think when we do so, we'll find, oh, yes, there's this other neighbor or other person who agrees. So feel a little more bold to go for it. Number 2. Yeah, or whoever number 2 was.
The stories you tell in the entire religious atmosphere and whatever else can inflame me and others and make me and others angry. But I've found that inflammation and anger only makes me speak louder and not more effectively.
Yep.
And the question I want to know is, as far as your tactics and whatever else, what can the average person really do with 5 minutes a day, or a half hour a week, or whatever time you have? What difference can it really make? I mean, religious folks and political folks have an answer for everything that's almost impossible to counter it with logic, because it's not logical. So what can the average person really do? I mean, how can you really make a difference? What can I do with 5 minutes of my day?
One, well, first make it 10. 10 minutes would be good. Yeah. But here's what I think when you talk about talking to elected officials. There are folks, and I talked about a few of the extreme examples at the beginning of my remarks, who you're not going to reach if you're talking about elected officials. I mean, I'm not going to reach Representative Joe Pitts from Pennsylvania, who is a member of the family, for those of you who are familiar with that, and who worked especially hard to make sure that condoms were not distributed in Uganda. And he's been successful, and HIV rates have now, under Clinton, they were going down in Uganda, now they're going back up. And Joe Pitts had a lot to do with that. So am I going to be able to persuade Joe Pitts? No. No, I'm not. And then there's people who are in Congress who are strong church-state separationists. Barney Frank was pictured up there. He's with us on issues. The middle, the squishy ones, in the middle, where the decisions are made in many cases, here's what I think they respond to. I was majority whip, and the hard reality, I don't think will surprise you, is that politicians always look over your shoulder when you're a lobbyist, and they look at two things. One, the number of dollars that your organization has, or that they can express that they have, and then the number of people that stand behind that organization votes. And we, in the secular movement, the separation of church and state movement, we need to say, like I mentioned about the 50-state plan, we need to say, let's organize. Let's start taking our meetings to the level of we would go and visit a member of Congress. I'm not saying you waste your time if they're so extreme that they're not persuadable, but a lot of them are. And let's go have a visit to a member of Congress. Let's certainly do the action alerts, but let's go beyond that and organize to meet that level. We haven't done that yet. And California, and it's a big job, it's a huge state, but what I want to see is that there is a secular coalition for California, and that we can help you with the issues. We have them on our website to talk about at a federal level. And then, as you guys build an organization and a movement statewide, you start to say, well, maybe we're going to start talking about analogous issues at a state level, and there usually is a state analogy. So you get out there and show that you exist, show that you're organized, and when politicians start to see that, they start to respond. I won't sugarcoat it. That's why it's our secular decade, not our secular year. This is not a tomorrow process. This is us agreeing together that if the religious right can do it, and they did, then we can too. I mean, one last point to illustrate this.